Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is April 18th. Today, we remember a day that forever changed American diplomacy and introduced the world to a terrifying new form of warfare. It was April 18th, 1983, when a suicide bomber drove a van loaded with explosives into the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon, killing 63 people. Today, we'll discuss what was one of the first major suicide attacks against an American target abroad and how it marked a turning point in how the U.S. and the world would understand terrorism. Let's get started. April 18th, 1983 was a warm Monday afternoon in West Beirut. The U.S. Embassy sat along a coastal road in the Ain al-Marisa district, a 7-story building overlooking the Mediterranean filled with diplomats, Marines, Lebanese staffers, and civilians coming and going for meetings or visa appointments. And then, just after 1 p.m., everything changed. A delivery van sped toward the embassy entrance. Inside was 2,000 pounds of explosives. The driver pushed past security, and before anyone could react, a bomb detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. It tore through the front of the embassy, collapsing floors, blowing out windows for blocks, and sending smoke and dust high into the Beirut sky. People hundreds of yards away felt the shock wave. Inside the embassy, it was chaos. Concrete slabs pancaked down into offices. Doors were blown off hinges. Desks were flattened, and the air was thick with dust, smoke, and panic. Outside survivors, many of them bleeding and disoriented, stumbled through the rubble as locals, emergency workers, and U.S. Marines raced in to help. In just seconds, the embassy had become a war zone. 63 people were ultimately killed in the attack. 17 of them were Americans. They included Foreign Service officers, Marines, and several members of the CIA, including one of the agency's most respected Middle East analysts, Robert Ames. Ames wasn't just a career intelligence officer. He was a vital link between the U.S. and moderate voices in the region, working behind the scenes to build trust where so much had been lost. His death was absolutely devastating, not just for the CIA, but for U.S. diplomacy across the Middle East. Also among the dead were 32 Lebanese embassy staffers, including guards, secretaries, drivers, and translators. Many were simply just doing their jobs. They were people whose names rarely made headlines, but whose loss was felt deeply by their families and their communities. Another 14 civilians and visitors were killed. People had just shown up that day for routine business, never knowing it would be their last. Over 120 other people were wounded. The scale of the attack was staggering, and while Lebanon had been plagued by violence for years, the use of a suicide bomber in a politically motivated attack against a U.S. government building was something new and terrifying. Soon after the bombing, a group calling itself Islamic Jihad claimed responsibility. At the time, little was known about them, but years later, intelligence would reveal that Islamic Jihad was a front tied directly to Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shiite militant group that would rise to global infamy in the decades to follow. And behind Hezbollah, it was Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. They provided funding, training, and strategic direction. No one was ever prosecuted for the bombing, but the evidence gathered in the years that followed through intelligence sources, documents, and interviews pointed clearly toward Iranian involvement. And it wasn't just a spontaneous act, it was a message to the United States. And the message was chillingly clear. American power was not untouchable. Diplomats were not off limits, and suicide bombing had entered the playbook. In the hours after the blast, the U.S. Embassy in Beirut looked like a collapsed parking garage. Emergency crews, Lebanese civilians, Red Cross workers, U.S. Marines all dug through the rubble with their bare hands. They pulled out survivors. They pulled out bodies. That night, President Ronald Reagan addressed the nation. He said, quote, "This despicable act was an attack on all of us. We will not be driven from our mission," end quote. But behind closed doors, U.S. officials were rattled. They had never seen anything like this before. 17 American government employees had been killed. The front of an embassy had been vaporized, and the people who had done it hadn't even tried to get away. This wasn't a kidnapping or a hijacking. This was something else entirely. In the weeks that followed, the U.S. began evacuating non-essential embassy staff from Beirut. But American involvement in Lebanon didn't end. And just 6 months later, tragedy struck again, when a suicide bomber drove a truck into a U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 241 service members. The embassy bombing was a wake-up call, but it would take more than one tragedy for the world to understand just how much things had changed. In 1984, the Inman Report, named after Admiral Bobby Inman, recommended sweeping overhauls to diplomatic security. Embassies were redesigned, high walls went up, security perimeters were extended, and the Diplomatic Security Service was expanded into its own bureau. Gone were the days of open-access embassies with glass doors and sidewalk-level entryways. From then on, American diplomatic buildings would look more like fortresses. The bombing also changed how the U.S. defined terrorism. No longer confined to hijackings or assassinations, terrorism had taken a new form: asymmetric warfare, acts of mass violence by shadowy groups, often backed by nation-states, striking without warning. The bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut on April 18, 1983, was more than a moment of violence. It was a moment of reckoning. 63 people lost their lives that day, including some of the United States' most skilled diplomats, brave Marines, and deeply dedicated local staff. People like Robert Ames, who had spent his career building fragile bridges between cultures, gone in an instant. Lebanese citizens, drivers, guards, office workers, people who had shown up that morning just to do their jobs, never made it home. For their families, the grief didn't make front-page news, but it ran just as deep. A small memorial now stands. It's a quiet place to reflect on a tragedy that changed the world. It reminds us that those who serve overseas, diplomats, soldiers, intelligence officers, local staff, do so not in search of glory, but in pursuit of peace. And on April 18, 1983, they paid the ultimate price. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. It'll really help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!